Join me for a conversation about the current state of the carbon markets, high-quality soil carbon removal credits. How did this company manage to sell $5 million worth of them, and where's the market going, and why did Nestlé, Microsoft and Shell started buying? Why does our guest argue that it's time to sign up now as a rancher and not wait to sell your carbon later? Where's the science in all of this regen grazing, and what about methane? And why is this actually not about carbon? This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, Investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. Or find the link below. Welcome to another episode, today with the co-founder of Grassroots Carbon. They paid over $5 million since 2021 to ranchers, and they're the owner of PastureMap, which is actually one of the few exits in the regen tech space. Welcome, Henk.
Yes, thank you so much, Koen. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and talk about regenerative practice and what it actually can do.
Yeah, it's been, I checked, 4 years since we had Ed, which is one of the co-founders of Soilworks, which is the owner of Grassroots Carbon, and 4 years just seems like a lifetime ago in regen. So I'm very happy to check into one of their, let's say, daughter companies, and of course what happened to PastureMap and what's happening to ranching, and real money is changing hands, it seems. But to start with a personal question, we always like to kick off with how come you spend most of your awake hours thinking about soil, carbon, and ranching?
Yeah, indeed. Most of my awake hours I do think about soil, carbon, and ranching, and how to improve that and how to increase the scale even there. But also the remark that 12 years ago, I never thought about soil in my life, like probably most people. And that all changed when I met Peter Big. Peter Big is a movie maker, professor from Arizona State University, and I worked at a large Dutch-British energy company, and I worked in a group called Game Changer, where we invested in people with crazy ideas which were too difficult to invest in for a normal company, but the Game Changer group had a budget to actually do that. And Peter Big came to us with this idea that you can store massive amounts of carbon in soil. It's not only about carbon, it's also about ecology restoration of birds, insects, wildlife, water storage, where you also improve the life of the farmers and ranchers who are actually doing this type of stuff. And he said, you need to invest in that. And I became the project manager and said, yeah, sure, that sounds like a fairy tale. That's not possible. All these positive benefits.
I mean, I guess you heard a few of those in your time.
Yeah, exactly. So we thought this is another one. Where's the flaw? So we started to dive into this and start to think, where are the flaws? This may be not scalable. Maybe it's not proven. Maybe it's not robust. Maybe you cannot do it fast enough. All these typical questions you ask as an investor. We start to measure soil carbon storage on ranches, left and right side of the fence. So one farmer is actually doing the regenerative practice, and the neighbor is not doing this. We did that on about 10 ranches in Canada. And when the results come back and you talk to more and more experts all over the world, you start to realize, how could we miss this incredible opportunity of storing carbon at a massive scale with all these other benefits. So that was 12 years ago. That started. Before that, I never thought about soil really. And after that moment, when we interacted with Peter Big, soil never left me. And it changed literally my life as well. Yeah.
And why do you think that is? I mean, I stumbled upon probably around the same time, 13 years ago, on the work of Alan Savory, Bruce Wade, and Tony Lovell, mostly the last two in Australia, and which gave birth to SLM Partners. And also there, the carbon piece was a very fundamental piece. But then I saw the deck of them raising money for a real asset, a real farmland fund. And they didn't mention the carbon piece. And I asked Tony about it. And he said, I want to be taken seriously by institutional investors, mostly pension funds, etc. And so it was almost then a shame to talk about the carbon potential, which is fascinating. Of course, this is 13, 14 years ago. So things have changed. But why do you think I'm not saying this is a hallelujah story of the solution to everything is underneath our feet, but why have we ignored at least a big part of the solution for so long?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, I think. I think it starts with the training of farmers and ranchers. It starts about society moving away almost from nature, and I think in the last 100 years, moving towards technical solutions to cure issues we see in an ecosystem. I think about the fertilizer, or pesticides, or herbicides, and that kind of almost. I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but a kind of a naive engineering mindset that you can solve problems by single issue management turned out to be kind of wrong. And I think why this is getting more interest now is that we reached maybe the boundaries of a system. There are so many ranchers and farmers in kind of dire straits economically that a ranch is not profitable. With the climate change we start to experience, we see that in the United States, continuously extreme weather events, probably driven by climate change. You reach the boundaries of what your system can handle if you're not going back to making that system more resilient, how nature used to be and how nature used to work.
And yet you see many, and you live in Houston and many other places as well, really still doubling down on the technology solutions or potential solutions, from direct air capture to precision fermentation. And a lot of these things, I think if you calculate the energy piece, it doesn't make any sense, and it won't for a very, very long time, if ever. But still, we really, or a big chunk of us, let's say, none of the listeners of this podcast, obviously, but a big chunk of all of us, let's say, the bigger us, is still going down that techno solution route. Like, do you see that shifting also in your, let's say, outside your soil bubble, that people start to look more at this nature-based solutions, or like people that are not close to soil or haven't studied it for 12 years starting to open up to that? Or is it still...
Koen, I hope you avoided the direct air capture, because if there's one button you should not press with me to ask about direct air capture.
6 minutes in, there we go.
So there we go. That's the topic where I said really have to stay calm and keep breathing, because it's one of the most irritating things you actually see. It's the naive engineering type of mindset to focus on a single issue. So completely agree, direct air capture is most likely not scalable, not affordable, enormous amount of energy and material use, and maybe logistics involved. So almost insane to waste money in there. So, funds are precious and scarce. So please invest them in those solutions which can have an incredible impact and which is scalable, and direct air capture is probably not one of them. It starts, I think, with the kind of mindset that you want to solve these problems in a technical way. That's how engineers were trained. That's how companies operate. And you can go back to the old Einstein quote from "You cannot solve problems within the framework in which they were created." And it's very hard for people to break that mental frame of thinking. So I've had a lot of conversations with folks in the energy industry, and it's a very robust frame. It's very difficult for them to break it. Of course, there's also an economic reason. So of course the business models are there. If we create a technology to do something with carbon, we can probably make money from carbon again. And first we made money from carbon getting it out of the soil, out of the reservoirs, and now we get money by putting the carbon back. So there's also strong economic reasons. But it's indeed a very naive technology mindset solution in solving these problems that way. Yeah.
And then why does it seem like you are having a moment in other places as well around, let's say, soil carbon and the credit side? I mean, you're paying real money. And I see that in Europe as well on low carbon grain and other things. Like there seems to be a shift, at least on the corporate side, on spending money on this, sometimes on the insetting within, let's say, products that come from, in this case, the beef or the grain, but also just companies that need to offset credits, and they start to look at the soil side of things. Has that shifted? Is that just, does it seem just from the outside, like where I'm looking, like how has that changed over the last, of course, 12 years, let's say, like when you start looking at it with Peter, how is that the market side of things changed?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a shift noticeable. So companies are interested, of course, in high quality carbon drawdown. First of all, I think there's a huge shift from avoided emissions credits, where basically I sometimes make a little bit of a joke. I have a tree and please pay me, otherwise I'll chop down the tree. It's almost a carbon hostage situation. That's avoided emissions and nature-based credits, to a situation where you have carbon removal, carbon drawdown credits, where you take a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere, reliably store it in soil or in other nature-based systems. That can be trees as well, of course. The shift is there. I think the focus is really on high quality. So what can you do to absolutely ensure that it's a ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2 stored and not just an estimate? I think that's a trend you clearly see. And a lot of companies are interested in these benefits beyond just carbon. And sometimes we say this is not about the carbon storage. And this is about really restoring grassland ecology. And yes, then automatically you also store carbon. You get all these other amazing impacts, from 10 times more water storage on certain properties, complete ecology regeneration. And the latest movies from Peter Big and Roots So Deep will also tell these stories and provide the evidence beyond all the scientific papers written about it. So companies start to realize that there's so much more than just carbon. And if you invest in these nature-based carbon removal credits, you get these impacts beyond just carbon, which are really important.
And so on the scientific side, because I think that the holistic management or AMP grazing or regenerative grazing movement got and still gets a lot of pushback from very loud voices, George Monbiot and some others that keep actually now lately Project Drawdown on food, again, really questioning or basically saying we're not good at math, the carbon potential of grazing differently. Like, have you seen a shift there as well? Because for these companies to be able to put this on their books, to actually invest real money and not, I mean, Shell did it back in the day, but it was a different kind of investment. These are buying credits, and you're gonna have journalists asking questions about it at some point, etc. On the scientific side of things that we talked about with Peter as well, of course, shout out to Peter. What has changed on the scientific side that larger companies can actually buy these and not have the scrutiny and not have a lot of pushback from some very loud voices?
Yeah, I think science is evolving from small little test plots where you try to mimic regenerative grazing to more landscape studies. And that's also what Peter Big has been doing with his team of top scientists in the US for many, many years now. But you see a lot of other universities are looking at whole systems. And that's, of course, really important. You see these differences when you visit the ranches. It's amazing, of course, to also listen to the stories of ranches. You can't call it, that's anecdotal stories, but it isn't. And you get it over and over. You see tremendous differences in what can happen in just a matter of a few years. On a ranch, you see water streams coming back, birds, insects, wildlife. And of course, you can measure these type of things. If you go back to soil carbon, there are several ways of measuring it. So in Grassroots Carbon, our company, we take 1 meter deep core samples, 3 feet deep core samples, That's more expensive, but you measure a lot more carbon that way, and it's way more resilient and robust in doing it that way. So I think it's important to measure. If you combine that with flux towers, where you measure basically eddy covariance towers, where you measure also streams, there's absolute, you can almost see the land breathe on a daily basis. So there's a lot of data available to actually do that. Of course, like with any scientific paradigms, there is an immune system which will fight back to these type of new insights because it's almost too simple. And I think that's almost a handicap. This is so simple and so natural that if you start to work with nature and not against nature, and the words Alan Williams used all the time, things start to change tremendously. So you can measure it. I think so. Back to your carbon credit questions, there's a trend as well that the companies who buy these high quality carbon credits wants to see the evidence and the transparency and the data transparency. So that is really important. And of course, there were players in the market who looked at 2 different satellite pictures and can tell you that carbon was stored. But that's not the way, of course, to reliably quantify how much carbon you store.
I'm laughing because this is the second interview I'm recording today, and we had Brigitte, not sure if it's going to be out when this is out, but very clearly stating that satellites cannot measure soil carbon and cannot look into the ground. Let's repeat that for the people in the back. But it's funny that it comes up in two different, completely different conversations. And then, like, what kind of questions or pushback do you get in, let's say, the procurement departments of these companies? What are the usual questions they ask, and how do you counter them when you get in and probably are compared to other, let's say, nature-based soil carbon or carbon credits, because you need to stand out and need to be part of a tender or need to be part of a process?
Yeah, it's quite a spectrum. Some companies have never heard about soil carbon storage. That's basically we're in the situation where I was 12 years ago or 13 years ago. So I completely understand where they are. So it's a lot of education, a lot of resources, providing resources, and try to get them to a range if possible so they can actually see what's happening. And that's the most convincing part. You put your hands in the soil and see what happens and how it feels. It's very convincing. We've done that with Marathon Oil Company in Houston. Basically also had an interview between Marathon Oil and ranchers. Very, very nice, put on video. So they believe in, indeed, the incredible impact you have beyond just carbon. There's a perception, of course, that nature is fragile. So nature is fragile. It's not robust. It's not like steel. It's that mindset from steel and reactors and pipes and compressors is robust, and you can measure it robustly. And nature is fragile. I think nature is not fragile at all. Nature is incredibly resilient in handling carbon. If you basically look where carbon is stored on the planet, and Peter Bick used these data as well all the time, it's that there's more carbon in the first 3 feet of soil globally than all biomass and all atmospheric carbon combined. So if you take the Amazon jungle and the forest in Indonesia and all the grasslands and all the atmospheric carbon combined, that's less than what's in the first 3 feet of soil globally. So nature puts carbon in soil. It's a very natural thing. And nature's doing that for hundreds of millions of years. So keep that in mind. As long as photosynthesis is around, it's being done that way. So very resilient. It's drought resilient. So if you have a drought for a couple of times, you will not lose your carbon stock. You will not add a lot more because you need water for photosynthesis, of course. But you will not lose it. You can have grassland fires. It will not negatively impact the carbon stock. You can just measure it. So very, very resilient, actually. But that's the mindset companies need to have. The whole thing of measurement, measurement is a challenge. If you have 5,000 acres and you need to determine the carbon stock. Carbon is, of course, not equally distributed, especially in grazing lands. So you need to take sufficient samples to get a reasonable assurance how much carbon is there. You have to come back 5 or 10 years later and remeasure. So you have to do that really based on scientific insights with the right sample technique and light stratification techniques to get reliable numbers there.
And is it another one that's been thrown at you for sure often? Great, it sounds amazing, regenerative practices, etc. What about feeding the world? And I'm not asking that specific question, but I'm asking, what have you seen from like all the ranches you've been working with in terms of carrying capacity, in terms of production of phytonutrients? Yes, it's not about the carbon, it is about the biodiversity, but it's also about producing a lot of food. And of course, by reducing drastically inputs. I don't know, the ranches you work with, are they using a lot of outside inputs or not? But what's that, let's say that transition towards way less or no input or very little to producing food, meaning turning sunlight into something we can eat, and taking that off the landscape. What are some insights? What are some stories? What are some narratives you have there?
Yeah, Koen, that's an excellent question. I think that's almost part of this kind of fairy tale. You can hardly believe it.
Free lunch.
If you start to think about it, and that's also all the information we get from Alan Williams and Gabe Brown and their organization Understanding Ag, who have worked with thousands and thousands of landowners in the US and outside the US, by the way, to actually help them in implementing these regenerative practices. And what you see basically is that these ranches, once their ecology systems start to regenerate after a few years, they can increase their stocking densities. And we don't be afraid now that, oh my gosh, that will give you way more methane emissions, so it's bad. It's not the cow, it's the how. You see quite often, and the first results start to come in, also from Peter Bick and other research teams, that methane emissions from cows eating this regenerative diet from lots of different plant species, they have much lower methane emissions.
How much lower are you seeing?
Excuse me?
How much lower are we talking about?
I want to be careful with numbers. I think they need to be peer reviewed, but I think incredible differences in numbers. It can be much lower. So I want to be very careful with quoting a number, because when people say, oh, that's not true. And it depends, of course, on the property you are and on the type of animals you have, but it's much lower. Back to your feeding the world, you see that most of these ranches can actually increase their stocking densities and carrying rate. And why is that? It's because the land grows more forage. So Alan Williams always said it's the easiest way to double the size of your ranch is to move to regenerative practice. You just grow more forage, so you can have more animals there. And if you really look at a large system, of course, this is moving away from growing corn in Minnesota and Iowa to feed the animals somewhere else in the United States. So this is about actually working with nature, mimicking how bison moved over the Great Plains in the United States with millions of animals. It's basically restoring how animal impact and grasslands work together in a normal natural ecology.
And just to double click or to repeat the methane piece, I think it's not to be underestimated how important that research is in field, because most, if not all, of the data we see and all of those graphs of the methane or actually emissions or carbon, it's always nice, the CO2 equivalent, the little e, of beef, etc., is, for as far as I've seen, based on research in CAFO operations. And that kind of feed obviously leads to a lot of disturbed cow stomachs and does a lot of methane. So I've been asking, where is the data from field? And the data is starting to come out drastically lower. Let's see the number. Drastically lower. There's a lot of discussion, I think, if certain bacteria in healthy grasslands can absorb that as well. And so it seems, I don't know, I don't want to be too not dramatic, but it doesn't seem like methane is a huge issue in, let's say, holistically managed or regeneratively managed or well-managed grasslands. And then let's not underestimate the immense carbon and other emissions that come out of grasslands being turned into arable. Like the plow, I think you're saying it's super durable. The soil is very resistant until we take the plow. Yeah. And the moment that happens, so we even if we don't harvest the meat and eat the meat, I think we owe it to the world to keep grasslands healthier and keep the grassland and not transitioning to arable, because we know from science that that's absolutely destructive in terms of emissions and in biodiversity. So I think but many people need to wrap their head, I think, around what is possible there and how basic agriculture can be, turning sunlight into something. And of course, if you have more solar panels, aka more plants and more leaves, you do more. And what we see outside in grazing is just the beginning or scratching the surface, pun intended, of what's possible in terms of biomass production, but then we get these romantic stories of bisons, and I think we lose people there partly because then it's just but like, who do we know? Like I don't know if that's a very convincing story. Like, it used to be hundreds of millions of bisons. Yeah, okay, but I don't think we can even imagine what it means in terms of ruminants now. But then, and it seems to be that these kind of arguments start to convince more and more companies. Have you reached the tipping point there? Like, do you see that now the interest in this kind of nature-based, I think there was some announcement last week as well, or 2 weeks ago, in terms of large procurements. You see Microsoft is a customer, Nestlé is a customer, of course an oil company is a customer. Do you see a tipping point, or are you still, like, we're at the beginning of that, hopefully exponential growth?
It's hard to predict, of course, what happens. I think we're at the beginning of an exponential growth. So more education, more data, more quality research to indeed regenerative systems will start to appear. Much better measurements start to appear. So yes, we're at the tipping point there. In combination with the realization that technology solutions, although they are shiny and look very cool, might not do the job at the end of the day. So they're not scalable. They're too expensive. But even besides just expensive, the cost of technology solutions, how can you envision to scale them to the billions of tons of CO2 we actually have to take out of the atmosphere? And nature can do that much faster, much more impactful. And it's not just about carbon. Even if we would build the fantastic CO2 sucking machine, we probably don't solve climate change enough. It's about all the other impacts which are important as well. It's soil erosion, it is water quality, it's cooling effects, it's a grassland cooling effect with just water evaporation and water. It's enormous. That might be even more important than this carbon storage. So yes, we're at the tipping point. It helps, of course, that well-respected companies like Microsoft and Nestlé start to buy significant volumes of these credits. And it's not easy to, of course, work with their technology teams and procurement teams. They ask all the questions and they want to have all the evidence that we do that in the right way. They're very careful for greenwashing, and rightfully so. So that starts helping. Our life in selling more credits is now much easier than it was 4 years ago.
And now let's switch a bit to the rancher perspective. Why would he or she engage now and not wait? What kind of contracts do you and conditions do you work with to avoid, of course, let's say the ones that have done a lot of practices for a long time are not getting compensated for the work they've done before? Like, how do you work with ranchers and what do you offer?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So a few years ago, at least the statement was it's kind of a carbon Wild West. And so the market is in full development and it's all over the place. So why not wait? And I've spoken at many rancher conferences in the US and addressed a couple of these questions. If you work with the right carbon credit companies who are really interested in doing the right thing for landowners and providing the right amount of financial stability and income there, participating now, provided that you have a contract which allows you to benefit from any increases in the carbon prices on a year-to-year basis, is actually beneficial. You get paid. Why wait? You get paid now. Be very careful what you sign up to. Ensure that you have a good profit sharing contract. Ensure that the carbon price can increase on an annual basis. So ensure that you are the main beneficiary from any improvements there are. But hey, starting now can really help. So as you mentioned before in the introduction, I think we've paid ranchers over $5 million so far. So that's real money. So yes, you can wait, but you miss out on an opportunity there.
And for ranchers, like, how big of a difference is this, let's say, per acre, per hectare? Like, how meaningful is this? Is this a nice extra, and does the real benefit come from the changing practices, reduced cost, improving carrying capacity, less veterinary bills, and all the other benefits we know? Yeah. Or is this a real driver to get people on the train, let's say, to change to change practices.
And we have about 90 landowners, or land stewards as we call them sometimes, under contract. And the feedback we get, this really helps. It's not the main driver. The main driver is to indeed improve the ecological health from your ranch, and that's what any rancher tries to do. But this helps them if you implement these regenerative practices or grazing type of practices, or whatever you want to call it. The focus on soil health, who at the end of the day helps you with your forage and helps you with your animal health. That's the main driver. Carbon payments at this point in time is a fantastic additional stream of income to also help you with some of the investments you need to do in sometimes water systems, sometimes flexible fencing systems. So it helps you to remove one of the barriers in moving to regenerative practices. But there's way more barriers. Sometimes it's the lack of knowledge, where to start, how to do this, what do I need to do at my ranch. So with one of the companies we're working with, we also provide a budget for on-site training by Understanding Ag. Alan Williams, Gabe Brown, I mentioned a few times, I think one of the top experts, but also the Savory Institute. So to get on-site support from where to start, how to do it, what mistakes to avoid. And we also try to build this kind of thriving community with our ranchers. We're just hired a very senior rancher success manager in our company to basically exchange these kind of experiences, what worked, what didn't work, what to avoid, how can ranchers help each other. So it's not just the financial benefits from a carbon payment. It is that helps, but it is also removing some of the other barriers to make that change. We understand it's difficult. It's doing something different what your parents have been doing, what your grandparents have been doing, what your neighbors are doing. I'm obviously not a Texas rancher, despite my West Texas accent. But if you talk to them, which we do all the time, they're sometimes very alone in a certain region in implementing these practices. You have to be a little bit of crazy to start doing this. And crazy for me is the good word for being innovative and being at the forefront of creating change. Sometimes we also observe that's being driven quite often by if the ranch is in financial difficulties, so you're being forced to create change, and that is very normal in innovation, of course. If you're comfortable in your comfort zone, and there will be no change, but you sometimes need a little bit of pressure to make that change. Yeah.
And how important is the market side of things for the meat basically coming off these ranches? How developed is that for the ranches you work with? Maybe that's super different, but how much of this is interesting and relevant for buyers, and interesting and relevant for end consumers, might be restaurants, direct to consumer? Like what's the market side of things? Or is this much more reducing input, reducing costs, getting paid a bit extra, but selling into a more commodified market?
Yeah, it's both. So I'm certainly not an expert on the market side of a ranch, but what we hear from our ranches, and some of them have fantastic direct supply chains into restaurants, into farmers markets, into meat delivery or protein delivery systems. Very important. I think the profitability for regenerative and grass-fed beef can be or other type of proteins can be much higher. But it's indeed a combination of less inputs, less fertilizer, less herbicides, less mechanical treatment of the land, which saves you labor and fuel and equipment you don't need anymore, plus a higher price for your potential product, plus a payment for the carbon you store in your soil year after year. Yeah, that can make your ranch 2 to 3 times more profitable if that works out well. So that can be very, very influential indeed on how the ranching community actually start to flourish again from a situation where it was really difficult to do that.
Yeah, because just to paint a bit of a picture, it's not that the ranching community is or was doing well inside the current system, let's say, or the conventional is not the right word, but let's say that the current status quo is absolutely not a walk in the park.
I agree with that. So absolutely. So yeah, also creating change is not easy.
No.
So deep respect for the land stewards who have the courage and the resilience to create that change. I think that if it would be my ranch, I can imagine how stressful that can be to completely change how you start implementing these practices. So I think it's also why very important to get support from experts who've been doing that, not to tell you what to do, but to help you to avoid maybe certain common mistakes. It's also very important for the ranchers we work with that they are in control of the ranch. We're not going to tell them what to do. We make it easier for them to implement the right practices. It's very important to a rancher is in control of the ranch. Obviously, they know best what they should do. But give them access to the support to make that act a little bit easier.
And of course, this depends on the context, but what are numbers that you've seen in terms of carbon removal per hectare? Probably easier than acre, but what have you seen, and what are numbers that you're comfortable with, let's say, in terms of actual carbon taken out of the atmosphere?
Yeah. So in the United States, we work with a ton of CO2 per acre per year. So if you want to translate it to the scientific numbers, you have to do the little math to turn tons of carbon per hectare, but we work with tons of CO2 per acre per year. Obviously, it depends where you are. There's basically two really important factors on which determines the carbon storage. It's your location, so what type of soil type, what is your local weather condition, especially, of course, how much rainfall do you have, because at the end of the day, it's photosynthesis where CO2 reacts with water. So if there's no water, there's no CO2 storage. And then the second really important thing is your land management practices. So if you do a fabulous job in regenerative grazing, you are really mastering that. You can store more carbon everywhere. That can even be to the far west where there are very dry and arid conditions. But it's of course way less carbon storage than if you're close to the Gulf of Mexico with tremendous rainfall and tremendous long growing season. So numbers are reported from higher than 6 tons of CO2 per acre per year in areas in the US and the Texas Gulf Coast where you have a long growing season and a lot of rainfall, to of course way less than half a ton of CO2 per acre per year if you go to the west where there's not a lot of rain. So it all depends, and it can depend strongly from ranch to ranch. So that's why it's important to just measure actually what the increase is. Yeah.
And that's like 2.5 to the hectare, basically. So that's significant.
You did the math, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's significant, and
it is significant, yeah.
And of course, then comes the question. Of course, it also depends. But have you seen like plateauing? Like how does it depend how degraded? Like have you seen already ranches that start to plateau at some point in certain fields where the storage has been filled? Let's say that's always the fear of many of the people in this way. I haven't seen any of that in real life yet. But what have you seen on that?
Yeah, we're not long enough in this business to observe that. But if you talk to experts like a Steve Applebaum, who is in this field for over 30 years, and a Jason Roundtree and a Richard Teague, famous professor from A&M, they don't believe so much in the plateauing situation. First of all, I think U.S. grasslands have lost maybe 50% of their soil carbon in the last 100 years due to overgrazing, due to the use of chemicals, fertilizer, all that type of stuff. And that's a kind of an average number. You must be careful with these numbers.
But it's a lot.
It's a lot. And I think globally you can see similar type of numbers. The other aspect from the plateauing is that you see if you start implementing regenerative grazing, your soil starts to also build on top. So you start to increase the thickness of the layer of healthy soil. So really positive thinkers, and I think actually realistic thinkers, see that you can increase the layer of topsoil, carbon-rich topsoil over and over. And you can see that in certain areas, of course, where it's meters deep. It's about restoring that. So before you reach a plateau, we probably, that might be 50 to 100 years, if at all. You might keep increasing the thick layer of carbon-rich soil.
And what about the avoidance of non-organic fertilizer? Is that something, first of all, is that an issue? Not an issue. Is that an input used very often? I know in Europe, in many cases, it is. And the avoidance already of that on grasslands combined with better grazing, basically starting to grow more grass with grazing and avoiding, that is a huge emissions avoided, because chemical fertilizers obviously have a massive footprint. Is that an issue? Is that interesting, relevant for where you're working, or not at all?
It's less relevant. I think some ranches in the US are farms. They use the name farm and ranch are used depending where you are. As some smaller farms, I think, will use fertilizer. So yes, if you move to regenerative practice, where you can get rid of the addiction to fertilizer because you don't need it anymore, or you need way less, depending on where you are, it really helps. If you go more to larger ranges in Texas, they were not using fertilizer in the first place. They're way too large. That will be unaffordable. But there you just basically see the natural fertilization, because of the higher stocking densities and the long resting period will do the trick for you there. The credits we deliver in Grassroots Carbon are pure carbon drawdown credits. So you will not get avoided emission credits. So it's absolutely fantastic to not use fertilizer anymore from a carbon perspective, but we will not give you the credits for it. And we only look at the credits being taken out of the atmosphere and reliably stored in the soil for long term. And that's important for most of the buyers. A company like Microsoft, one of our customers, only wants carbon removal or carbon drawdown credits, and they don't want nature-based avoided emission credits.
And what about biodiversity? You mentioned it a few times on, I don't think there are many, if all, credits yet, but is that something, and the water side, like something you're looking at, something the customers are interested in? What about the biodiversity piece? Yeah. Objectively, probably more important than carbon. I mean, if you take care of biodiversity, carbon will be taken care of and not the other way around. So what about the birds, the bees, and everything around it?
Yeah, you're spot on. It starts, of course, all with ecology regeneration, and that's all about biodiversity, birds, insects, wildlife, soil health, soil microorganisms, everything you can see there, vegetation, tremendous diversity. Have measured that a few times. We're not systematically measuring that. It's very high on our agenda to start doing that and finding a simple, scalable, and affordable way of doing that.
Good luck.
And there's, of course, all kind of technologies what you can use to actually tell the biodiversity thing. We're starting to work with two very large environmental organizations in the US, who have also experience in doing that. So we're very positive in collaborating with these organizations to actually make big progress on how to scalable and reliable measure biodiversity. Water is also very high on our agenda. You can measure water infiltration rates rapidly fast. We're not doing that, but it's the plan as well to start doing the first water measurements on ranches, hopefully even the end of this year. Yeah.
And so what's the bottleneck at the moment? Is it more on the ranching side, the training, the let's say the market side of the credits? What's holding you back to stay in Silicon Valley terms, to go 10x?
To 10x on carbon or on biodiversity credits?
On your size, on your impact. On your impact.
It's pure demand. It's not landowners. I think the landowner transition point is past. Tipping point is past there. There's many landowners interested in joining our program. Grassroots Carbon is very conservative. We first want to ensure that we sell the credits before we sign up the landowners. So not that we sign you up and you keep your fingers crossed, maybe we sell your carbon storage at one day. We walk the other way around. We first want to ensure that we've sold the credits, and then we actually offer contracts to landowners. And we quite often take a year. We talk to the buyers that we need about a year to basically fulfill your order, depending on the size of the order, of course. With many of these buyers, we have longer term contracts that can be 5 years, 10 years for very large volumes. So from our perspective, it's the demand side. Working indeed with companies to you buy large volumes consistently for longer terms of carbon storage. Yeah. Carbon removal. And
does it hurt now, or like the tendency, it seems currently at least, some of the ESG targets, some of the let's say sustainability targets of large corporates are being reduced, or at least it seemed to be like there was a tendency, I think, until a year ago or so, that everything seemed to go through the stars. Or to the stars and back. And now it seems, I don't know if there's realism, but there are quite a few targets are being scaled down a bit. Do you see that in your specific part of the market as well? Or not yet, or not at all, actually, in terms of commitments, in terms of buying? What's the market compared to like a year ago or so?
Ooh, you see a little bit of hesitation by some companies to wait. And I think that partly has to do, of course, with the environment in the United States where we operate at this point in time. We're not operating in Europe at this point in time, but it might change. Where, there's just a voluntary market. There's no hard requirements to do this. You do this because you want to mitigate risk or you want to have a better market position. But those are the drivers. I think there's some hesitations of the companies. Let's wait till elections were in the United States, see what happens. And maybe you can buy a few years of not being active. There's also a lot of companies basically are in this space that they feel carbon pressure. I think very few companies are in a business as usual situation. Most of them feel a carbon pressure. They have to do something, but then what? So they're in this situation that they have to map their carbon footprints, which can be very complex and complicated if you have a large integrated operation. And then you have to come with a carbon strategy, and that is really difficult. So what now? There's so many options, what to select. So that whole process of moving from a realization that you have to do something towards action can take a lot of time. And then there's what hurts as well, I think, is the negative press on carbon credits. And so in general, carbon credits is not really a solution. That basically is people should just have less emissions. Well, I think carbon credits, especially carbon drawdown credits, are the fantastic solution to start doing right now while you're working on your carbon footprint and your mitigation strategies and reducing your emissions. You can do something right now of immediately taking action and removing carbon out of the atmosphere. So it's not a end of the solution type of end of all your carbon solutions type of opportunity. It is something which you can do immediately, and I think that's a kind of a mindset which companies need to adopt. And I think the negative press about carbon credits in general, maybe from the purist, we don't need CO2 anymore, is actually not helpful, because at the end of the day, even if we stop with all the CO2 emissions, we still have too much carbon in the atmosphere. So we have to remove carbon out of the atmosphere. Companies can do that right now with nature-based carbon drawdown. I think that's the beauty there. That again requires education, requires mindset shift. So that's a little bit of the challenge there.
Yeah, the scandals around Vera and others, North Pole or South Pole, definitely don't help. No. And do you see interest from like the companies where insetting could be interesting, where they are actually buying meat or they're let's say exposed to the beef industry? Are they starting to be interested in this? Because in their scope 3 emissions, for sure the biggest part or one of the biggest parts must be their production or their indirect production if they don't own the ranches. Like, how is that starting to develop in your field?
Yeah, I think insetting is important. So yes, we work with Nestlé, and Nestlé is very interested, of course, in insetting. So we're doing that. You see the connection. It's an easier sell to companies who have a connection with agriculture and care about soil health and ecological health.
So with Nestlé, you're actually working with their beef producers that then end up in Nestlé products?
We're working in the supply sheds of Nestlé. Yeah, wow. Absolutely. Yeah. So that's very fascinating, and we're exploring how to expand that even. So companies with a connection to agriculture and soil, that makes it easier, of course, to get a connection to regenerative practices and regenerative-based carbon storage. Other companies realize that the benefits beyond just carbon can be very important as well, and that can be the narrative. So yes, it's not just the carbon we remove, but we increased water storage, we increased biodiversity. So that's why it's important as well, I think, to start measuring water and biodiversity impact as well, to basically have better data behind just a narrative.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at your client base, it's sort of two groups. It's the food companies, or company in this case Nestlé, and let's say businesses with very high margins and good cash flow, and they can afford this. In this case, the Microsoft, the Shells, etc. They should of course be all doing it, but especially industries. You see it at Shopify or Shopify, and mostly Stripe. In the carbon space, not necessarily the natural carbon space, but you see, of course, industries where there's, I'm not saying easy money, but where there's money, these things become easier because a few million here and there is not something they're going to miss, let's say, at the end of the year. And then shifting a bit to the finance space, if we would do this in the financial capital of Texas, which could be Houston, could be Austin, I don't know, but maybe, or let's say San Francisco or New York, and we do this conversation live in front of an audience of investors, either their own money or institutional capital, so other people's money. What would be your main message you would like them to walk away with? Of course, they're going to be inspired and walk away excited about the future in this case, but if there's one seed you want to plant in their mind, what would that be?
Yeah, I think investing in regenerative training would be really important. I have to think about how to build a business model around it. So it's about the impact you get is by removing these barriers to implement regenerative practice. And there's a whole series of barriers around it. So make it easier for folks to invest in the ranch infrastructure that they might need, and make it easier to get support and training. And those might not be the kind of sexy investments you get. It's not an investment in the shiny steel object of direct air capture. However, the impacts, the regenerative impacts and the business impacts from a ranch can be tremendous and much, much higher. So there is something there. It will be cool to explore these type of business models. So how can an investment in unlocking this regenerative capacity lead to tremendous value? And it's there, because that is we talked about it before. It's a way of basically virtually doubling the size of your ranch, doubling the output, making the ranch economic again. So there is a tremendous value generation opportunity there. And it sounds a little bit fragile.
No, it's up to the investors to figure that out, and the entrepreneurs.
Yeah,
it is interesting because the education piece keeps coming back. And of course, you have amazing consultants and a number of people that have built actually consultancy businesses around it. I mean, Kate Brown and the crew, Understanding Ag, John Kempf, but not many others. And also there, the question is always, how scalable is that? How repeatable? Like, how do you get to from 4 million acres to 40 million and to 400? And I don't know if I don't have the answer at all, but I think we need way more people that are entrepreneurs mainly that are going to try to crack that code. And I think somehow we can learn from the permaculture movement that also with some very small investments at the beginning, I think there are now trainings everywhere. And the amount of people I speak to, not necessarily building permaculture farms or gardens now, but went through a permaculture design course and it changed their life because it changed their perspective on design, business, on nature and ecology, biology, etc. And that, I mean, the people that funded that at the beginning might be just a group that set it up. Their impact is immense without that it needs continuous investing. So there's something to learn from grassroots movements like that. How important is technology in that? How important is pasture map in the education piece in your work?
Yeah, technology can be of great support and great help. Pasture map is basically a tracking tool to help you with scheduling your cattle rotations in a more effective way. We're working on pasture map to collect way more data. It's also actually the data of showing what happened on a ranch to measure additionality, and you need to do something different on the ranch to qualify for carbon credit. So pasture map is a beautiful tool to do that, but also measure all kind of other things. Pasture map can be converted into a ranch simulator. So, wow, if you have this ranch, look, can you start playing with managing the ranch in a different way and then getting an indication maybe on the dashboard from, hey, this is how your ecology changes, this is how your soil carbon might change. So it can be a good ranch simulator type of tool as well.
Almost becomes like a a digital twin or virtual twin, so you can play with different scenarios, which it seems like with the immense compute power that we're starting to play with against an interesting cost, becomes very fundamental, because you can play a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different grazing scenarios as well, and maybe integration of trees or what kind of herbal lay you're using, or what kind of if you're seeding your grass at all or not, and how that might change, etc. And see that in advance and almost walk through it. We had Jason of Regen Farm on, might be out at this time, might be not, but they were talking like it was very easy for them to turn it into a virtual reality piece, that with glasses you could actually walk through how a farm would look like, and how square meter by square meter could see how millions of different models or different scenarios, which with the world where you come from, the scenario planning department of Shell is famous, but millions of different scenarios, you can see where a piece of land or a farm could go to or not, depending on climate, depending on practices, etc. That kind of tech seems to be coming now, or seems to be there now, and wasn't there a few years ago, or maybe just in a few very small, very expensive places.
Yeah, so I think that can certainly be helpful. I think the other tech aspect is how can you get more live data from your ranch. Of course, a rancher now looks at vegetation and looks at soil, but can you have remote sensing technologies? Can you look at bird sounds? Can you look at insect sounds? Can you look at DNA samples much faster? There's a lot of opportunities there, I think, but also there, satellites can play a tremendous role, of course, to see what's happening on a ranch very rapidly, get early warnings that you're in the right direction, or, hey, that something is going in the wrong direction. So I see a lot of opportunities there as well.
Yeah, and I mean, these are massive properties where what you're talking about. Like, there's no way you can keep an eye on all of it. Like, there's no way you're going to be on your horse, in your helicopter, or on your quad, surveying every nook and cranny of your rent. It's just not going to happen. And so how do you monitor and measure and make management decisions based on real data and real grass growth, instead of modeled or potential or Excel or paper, which I think I remember some interviews somewhere with the founder of PastureMap, like she was saying, we move people from paper planning to digital planning. Like, that's the big step. And then we can do a lot of other things, but that's the first switch. And then we can unlock the power of technology there, which I think seems like you're even now only at the beginning of.
Yeah, so PastureMap is now actively being used by our landowners to do much better planning, but also much better record keeping. It's quite often if you go to ranches now, you ask, hey, how did you rotate the last 3 years? And so, well, let's see if we have a notebook somewhere where that's being tracked. So there's lack of record keeping, rightfully so. I understand that, but doing that in a better way might also help you capturing learnings much faster. PastureMap has a lot of features for different type of animals. There's photo tracking, so every time you move animals from one paddock to another paddock, there's photo capturing. There's also evidence that you did that. So it also helps with the quality behind the credits at the end of the day. Seeing that transitions were made were really additional, and that really practices were implemented. That's what a lot of the standards, of course, require, that you have hard data. Yeah. And do that in a way that's not painful for a landowner to capture.
Yeah, because that's one of the fears, I think, for many people. Oh, another thing that I have to fill out, and another more paperwork or digital paperwork, and another set of questions, et cetera, et cetera. And if we would flip the question or the position and put you in the driver's seat of an investment fund or an investment portfolio, let's say, and you had to put, let's say, a large amount, $1 billion to work, what would you focus on, or what would be important pieces of your portfolio if you had to put that to work and get a return at some point, get it back at some point, but it could be very long term. So you're pretty free, let's say, to put this kind of money to work.
That's fantastic. Cool. Thanks for that question. That's cool. It's all about scale. I think really to the potential of regenerative grazing and the impacts that has on grassland ecology, water storage, incredibly important, biodiversity, and also soil carbon is there. The potential is enormous in the United States. and a lot of other places in the world. So it's about scale. How can we unlock that scale much faster? I think that's where the $1 billion should go to. It starts with a huge chunk of the $1 billion should go to scalable education and support. It's not just education, not training. It's support on your ranch to educate you and help you to learn how to manage your ranch in a different way. So that's one. The second will be indeed to better measurement systems to have much better feedback loops, so you can do that even easier. And that's how I would spend the $1 billion. And then potentially also, if there's infrastructure needed in the supply chain to get access to higher value markets for the products coming from a ranch, cool, let's use that as well. That will only, so it's basically looking at what are the barriers at this point in time to implement these practices on a ranch and remove those barriers. It's not about carbon. Carbon will automatically come. So I'm not talking about an investment in carbon measurement or whatever. That's probably not what it is. This is about unlocking the enormous potential from nature of restoring ecology and restoring soil carbon storage.
And how important do you think the health side of things is going to be, is maybe already is, with the research coming out of the group around Stefan van Vliet and the Bionutrient Food Association? I know it's not really part of Roots So Deep because I don't think there was budget to do the measurement on health. But like, is especially on the protein side, it seems to be the most interesting place to start, which is, I think, literally what Eric Jackson of the Bionutrient Food Association said. Like, what do you see there? You don't have a lot of exposure, of course, to the market side of things, or where the beef ends up. But what do you hear on the ranches? And is the healthy soil leads to healthy grass, leads to healthy animals and healthy gut system and people? Is that a conversation already or not yet?
It is a conversation at the beginning. You probably can compare it a little bit indeed. So indeed, healthy soil microbiome and healthy gut microbiome leads to healthy human beings and healthy animals. That relation should be almost there if you think about it. Healthy human beings also is a complex system. It's like soil. So how do you measure in complex dynamic systems impacts? It's a similar type of problem. How do you measure impact of regenerative grazing on total ecology systems? So that requires a holistic approach of looking at that type of research rather than changing one single attitude. I think we're getting there. The connections are really there. That's just a matter of time before that becomes more important to look at nutritious food, look at nutrition density in food, look at the foods created without a lot of chemical use. The trend is there, I think, but more evidence will come over time.
Yeah, so it's absolutely what I hear. It's not part of conversations yet in terms of a potential driver for, let's say, the consumer side of things.
You see that I think that there's a thriving farmer market community in the US where people, and you see that probably in Europe as well, maybe even more so, where people are very conscious where their food is coming from. Local food grown in the regenerative way. If you go to a farmer's market in Houston, you can actually see that some farmers, it's regenerative grass-fed grazed animals. So people realize that is different. So it's getting there. It's, I think, a very small micro fraction, but the trend will be there. At the end of the day, producing food this way doesn't have to be more expensive at all. It's moving in a system where we start paying, I think, for nutrients rather than just the kilogram or the pound scale. So how many nutrients do you actually buy? And the pricing will be very different. I heard that on a conference. It was very, very fascinating from Fred Provenza. So where are you actually looking? What are you actually buying? Is that a pound of protein or is that a pound of nutrition? And that makes you look at the pricing also in a different way.
And when you go to these conferences and like to the grazier conferences where, of course, everyone or almost everyone is on board on AMP grazing and regenerative grazing. And this question comes from John Kemp, who asks us, where do you think differently than your peers, or what do you believe to be true about regenerative agriculture that others don't? And I like to ask it in your bubble when you go to these conferences. What do you believe to be true that most people there don't? Like, where are you contrarian within the bubble of regen, grazing, and carbon?
So we go to a lot of different conferences, and we also go to large general agricultural conferences and grazing conferences, and estimated maybe that 95% of the farmers and ranchers in the United States are not deploying these type of practices. So they look at it as from, whoa, these guys are a little bit crazy. And that's also
But they must have heard about it, right? They must have seen somewhere somebody in Ellen Savory speech by accident, a TED talk. Like, is there interest, curiosity? What's the general feeling, or just hostile?
It's the spectrum. Some of them will be hostile. Some of them will be very interested. So I think Peter Big does such an incredible. If any one of your listeners has the opportunity to look at Roots So Deep, the latest
it's streaming
series
in the
Peter
US
Big.
and Canada now. So anybody there,
absolutely.
Stream it. Go and watch
stream it. You can download it.
Yeah, we do a screening here in a bit. When this is out, we've done the screening, the first European one, but it's out in the US and Canada. So go and see it, please. And let us know.
Peter is amazing in storytelling. With how basically neighbors. One of the neighbors is deploying grazing or regenerative practice, and the other neighbor is not doing it. And they look at each other, but they don't ask questions. So Peter connects them and have the conversation going on. And so that's very insightful. So there is a spectrum. So some of them are more hostile, I think. Some of them are curious, but I completely understand. Must be very, very difficult to completely change how you operate your land and how your parents and grandparents were doing that. So that's not an easy decision to make. So it's very easy for people sitting in an office saying, well, you should just change your practice. But of course, it isn't that way. That is your livelihood. It's your income. It's your family heritage. So that cannot be a light decision to make that change. You see quite often also that something happens in the families, that maybe there's a death in the family, or the new generation start taking over the ranch, where there's more interest to explore new type of practices. And of course, the more these conferences are being held, the more success stories there are. The more this becomes a kind of a new norm and a new paradigm. Yeah.
And then when you go to, let's say, the regen grazing conferences and the grass-fed exchange, or whatever they're called, where are you different there? Where do you think different there? If you're among the hardcore regen grazers, what's your what sets you apart?
In these conferences, it's absolutely great, of course, to see the tremendous energy and the openness of the attendees to help each other and share information and share what works and not works. So going there, it gives you it's important to go there sometimes to get the energy back from, yes, we're doing the right thing. This is actually really working at scale. Look at all these incredible success stories from how this all worked. So that's really important. And there, being able to help remove some of the barriers by carbon payments is actually amazing, of course. And folks who start implementing these type of practice, so they start doing something additional, and you can actually support them by paying real money for the carbon they store, is really making a difference.
And do they, let's say, meet you with suspicion as well, like the next one that comes and promises to pay for change, and like they must have had quite a few knocking on their door, let's say the ranchers, especially the ones that are relatively ahead of the game. Is there a bit of suspicion in that in that room then as well, because you come from very large food corporates and very large fossil fuel companies and promising to like what do you sense there?
Yeah, there should be suspicion. So we always encourage landowners to be very careful what they sign up to, and also when it comes to a contract, do their homework, ensure that they get lawyers involved. So be very careful what you sign up for. Our rancher team, so our team in Grassroots Carbon who interacts with the ranchers, all have regenerative farms. They implement these practices themselves, so they speak at the level. They understand what the challenges are. So we never try to force someone in doing these practices if they're not ready for it. It's I think the respect for how difficult it is to create this change. So it's It's very doable, but it's also very difficult in making that decision to implement that change. So yes, they should be suspicious. Be very careful if someone is offering you money. So look at the terms and conditions. Ensure that, I think very important, that you benefit from a carbon price increase. We offer a really profit sharing type of agreement. I think that's very important. Most of the benefits will go to the landowner. In our case, that's 70 or 80% of the profits will flow to a landowner. Ensure that you don't have to pay to participate. Look very carefully at the risk when something goes wrong at your ranch. When you have a drought, what are the impacts? So look very carefully about the exposure you have as a landowner. And see if you can benefit enough from the upsides. Yes, you should be suspicious. Do your homework. Yeah.
And as a final question, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing overnight, what would that be?
Yeah. So we already spent my $1 billion on the rancher training. It will be the realization in companies with a tremendous carbon challenge that nature-based solutions can offer a fantastic, fast, affordable, and impactful solution. So I think there's all those engineers, but also procurement people and ESG managers. If I could use my magic wand, I would immediately get it in their head that nature-based solutions, when done right, are really worth your time of looking into. That's the realization I want them to have. It's a real solution. And compare that to your technology solutions, and then make up the balance. So I'm not saying that it's good to have a healthy portfolio of carbon solutions in any company, but give nature-based solutions the opportunity it deserves, because there's actually very, very little alternatives with this amount of impact beyond just carbon, scalability and affordability.
I think it's a perfect end to this conversation. I want to thank you, Henk, so much for coming on here, of course, the work you do, but also taking the time to share. And I'm looking forward to not having another 4 years before checking in again with let's say, the world of soil works and Grassroots Carbon. So thank you so much for coming on here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for all the work you're doing, Koen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.